Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss any update from Rouse IAS Study Circle. Join the only official Telegram channel of Rouse IAS Study Circle to get the relevant materials and important updates. Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified. The what, why and how of the newspaper analysis from the Civil Service Examinations perspective. So today we are going to discuss The Hindu Delhi edition dated 26 July 2022. The topics which are to be discussed have been displayed on your screen and the timestamping of the same has been provided in the description box below. So now let us move towards our first topic. This topic has appeared at page number 5 in today's The Hindu Delhi edition. The topic is in relation to the floods that has occurred in the river Godavari and has created a panic in that particular region. And this is the very context of this very news article. It says that the fresh floods which has reoccurred in the span of just 15 days have led to huge losses of lives and properties in the basins of Godavari river. As far as the scheme of syllabus is concerned, this topic is mainly relevant in two papers, that is General Studies paper 1 as well as GS paper 3. In GS paper 1, we have a section of geography and a specific section of important geophysical phenomena. Similarly, in General Studies paper 3, we have a section of disaster management. And as we know that floods is an important geophysical phenomena as well as it is also a disaster and hence needs to be managed. So in this particular line, today's session will be dedicated to the reasons responsible for the floods as well as its prevention and management. Now, if you go by the previous year question paper analysis, the question said that differentiate the causes of landslides in Himalayan and the Western Ghats region. Despite the fact that this question is related to the landslides, but the underlying theme of this particular question is the difference in the factors responsible behind landslides in these two particular regions. Similarly, we are also aware about the fact that floods mainly occur in the perennial rivers, and that is the Himalayan rivers, or we can say the northern rivers. So what are those factors which are responsible for flooding situations in the northern India and similarly the flooding situations in the peninsular India? Now if you closely analyze this particular map, this is the flood zone of our country, and it is estimated that on an average every year 75 lakh hectares of land is affected by the floods, which lead to losses of around 2000 crores, and every year around 1600 lives are lost on account of flooding. As far as the region is concerned, again you can see here that the northern plains, that is the Satluj plains, Ganga plains as well as the Brahmaputra plains, they are most vulnerable to the flooding situations. However, in peninsular India also we have certain patches which experience floods. For example, in this particular map, the eastern coast is shown as vulnerable area. Similarly, we are also aware about the fact of the floods on the western coast, that is the Maharashtra, state of Kerala, etc. So are the reasons responsible for the floods in the northern rivers as well as peninsular rivers are same, or are those reasons are different? It might happen that certain reasons are common to both these regions. It might also happen that there are some reasons which are more dominated in particular area and the other reasons are more dominated in some other area. So this is basically the theme of our today's session. Now to understand the difference of reasons in the Himalayan or the northern plain regions or the peninsular regions, we must first understand the basic difference of geology as well as the basic difference of rivers in the north as well as in the south of India. So now as we all know that the Himalayas are made up of sedimentary rocks. These rocks are weaker in nature and hence they are highly prone to erosional activities. Similarly, the peninsular region, that is the Western Ghats, are hard rock system, and because of this fact their erosion is lesser in intensity. Even if you go by the geology of this peninsular rock, this is basically made up of igneous and basaltic materials. Again, igneous rocks are again hard and therefore there is a difficult erosion. Similarly, if you come to the rivers of the northern India, they are basically the perennial river system. The perennial river system means that throughout the year there is a water in them. And this water in these rivers are fed mainly by two sources. One is the glaciers of Himalayas and second is the monsoonal rainfalls. However, when it comes to the peninsular rivers, these rivers are seasonal in nature and they are mostly fed by the monsoon, that is the rainfall in this particular region. Yes, there are certain rivers, for example, Kaveri in Tamil Nadu, which is fed by the monsoonal rainfall throughout the year. That is, the upper reaches of the Kaveri is fed by the southwest monsoon during summers, and the lower reaches of Kaveri is fed by the northeast monsoon during winters. Okay, so the fact is we have to differentiate the geological factors as well as the characteristics of the rivers in these particular regions. This will in turn help us to understand that what are the different factors which operate in this particular region and what are those factors which are more dominated in this particular region. So now let us move ahead towards the analytical section. Now, as we have discussed that in the northern rivers, because they are deriving their water from the Himalayas, and Himalayas are basically sedimentary rocks which are more prone to erosion, this means that the sediment load which these rivers are carrying with them will be very high. And these sediments will be deposited the river courses and hence the river will start meandering. For example, if the river is coming in such a fashion and it is eroding the mountains on the upper reaches, it is also bringing the sediments with them. And these sediments, suppose if get deposited over here, this river course gets blocked and hence it changes its direction, leading to the flooding of these areas. Otherwise, if there would not have been any deposition, this river would move straight. But now because of this deposition, the lateral movement of these rivers have caused the floods in the adjacent areas. So that is why the sedimentary nature of rocks becomes the important reason which is different from the Western Ghats. In line with this, if you closely understand the length of the rivers, that is the rivers like Ganga, Yamuna, Brahmaputra, they are one of the mightiest rivers of the world, not just India. And because they have a very long courses, hence their erosive capacity also increase. Because the longer courses allow the rivers to bring these sediments from a very huge area and in turn this also increases the sediment load. But when you come to the Western Ghats rivers, these rivers have shorter courses. The third factor comes from the glaciers. Now, because we understand that the northern rivers are mostly fed by the Himalayan glaciers, so because of the climate change and resultant melting of these glaciers are also increasing the flood frequency as well as intensity in the northern plains. Then there are certain geophysical phenomena which are typically restricted to the upper reaches, that is the higher altitudes. For example, there are instances of GLOF, which is known as the glacial lake outburst floods. Then we also experience a number of cloudburst events in the Himalayas. So these factors also increase the discharge and the volume of the rivers. The fifth important factor is the monsoon. Now, because these northern plains, that is the Ganga and Brahmaputra plains, this entire northern plain stretch experiences the rainfall from both the branches, that is the Arabian Sea branch as well as the Bay of Bengal branch. And because they are experiencing the rainfall from both the areas and hence again the river volume, the water volume in those river basins, they increase. Then if you closely analyze the socio-economic status of these particular regions, they are very densely populated areas. And this becomes the another important reason. Now because these regions are densely populated and they are heavily dependent on the agricultural practices, because of high demographic load, there is a huge encroachment of the land. The floodplains are also encroached and the wetlands are also encroached, and this in turn reduces the carrying capacity of the river basin. For example, let's say that earlier the river was flowing in this particular path and the areas along the river banks were vacant. So let's assume that if the flooding situation starts, this river was having a space in its lateral side which can store the excess water. But now, because of very high demographic load, these areas are occupied by the habitants of that particular region. These areas are used for agriculture. These areas are sometimes also used for construction activities. So, the total area which could have subsumed the excessive water is reduced to this narrow belt. And that is why whenever there is a excess water in this river course, when it gets spilled, there is no area to store it, and hence the flood situation, the intensity of the floods increases in these particular areas. So these are some of the reasons which are most dominant in the Himalayan areas. But now the question arises, we have discussed that the peninsular rivers are shorter in nature. So what does exactly happen? We also know the fact that the geology of the peninsular area is very hard, and hence there will be lesser intensity of erosion. So what exactly happens in the peninsula? In peninsula now we know that because there are hard rock structure, and these hard rock does not allow the vertical erosion. Now, because rivers are not eroding the rocks vertically, and hence the depth of the river course will be very shallow. And if the river course is very shallow, then obviously, if there is an increase in amount of the water, that basin or that course will not be able to absorb that water, and hence because of this shallow nature of the river course, the water will spill in the lateral directions. So now if we understand that hard rocks, if are reducing the intensity of the erosion, it is also reducing the vertical erosion and hence leading to the shallow depth of the river courses. The second important factor is the steep slopes of the Western Ghats. Now, because the Western Ghats slopes are excessively steep, and hence, whenever the river moves downwards from these excessive steep slopes, there is a very high velocity. And as soon as these rivers hit the plain area, there is a sudden break in the slope, and hence the river, which upon reaching the peninsular area, it spills its water in the lateral direction. The third important factor is because these Western Ghats are located perpendicular to the Arabian Sea, and hence the rainfall is also very high in this particular area. The intensity of rainfall is very high. And because of this high intensity of rainfall, the erosion increases, and there are also the events of landslides. And because of these landslides, there is excessive deposition of the sediments on the river course, and the same phenomena takes place which was there in the rivers of the northern plains. Right? Then there are other anthropogenic activities also. For example, deforestation. Similarly, dam mismanagement. For example, one of the major factors behind the Kerala floods of 2018 was the dam mismanagement. Now let us understand that how dam mismanagement leads to flooding situation. For example, here we are having a reservoir, here we are having a dam which is built, and this is the downstream area of the dam. The reservoir is obviously filled with water up to its maximum level. That means, first of all, this area, that is the upstream area, is always flooded because of the presence of reservoir and the storage of water which takes place in that reservoir. That means that the dams lead to flooding in the upstream areas. Now let us imagine that the rainfall is taking place in this area, and that is why the water levels of the reservoir is increasing. Now what needs to be done? Before every monsoon, the gates of this dam must be opened so that this excess water can flow towards the downstream areas. But because we don't have very intelligent decision making systems, and that is why many a times it happens that the gates are not opened on time. Moreover, there is also a dichotomy between the policy goals. That is, if you need to support the agriculture, you must have excess water which can be provided for the irrigation facilities. So that means that the water must be stored in the reservoirs. On the other hand, we also face a situation that if the water level increases beyond certain limit, then we have to release this water. So when there is a sudden release of water, the kinetic energy of that water is very high. And this untimely fast flowing water when reaches to the downstream plain areas, because of its very high momentum, it again spills in the different directions, leading to the flooding again and now in the downstream areas. So that is what exactly happened in Kerala also. So now the objective of this discussion is again that you should be able to differentiate that which factors are more dominant in the northern rivers. So that is why the basic idea behind this discussion is that you should be aware that what are the dominant factors which operate in the northern rivers and which are those dominant factors which operate in the peninsular rivers. Obviously, again, there will be some reasons which will be common to both of these. For example, deforestation is the common factor, increasing construction activities, encroachment of the wetlands and floodplains areas, they are common to both the reasons. But then there are certain differences in the nature and characteristics of the river as well as of the geology of these areas. And because of the difference in these characteristics, the dominant reasons of the floods in both these regions also differ. So I hope that you have understood this point. Now comes to the management and the prevention or the control of these floods. Now the management and the prevention strategies for floods was discussed in the DNS of 22nd June 2022. In this DNS we discussed that what are the specific reasons behind the floods of the Assam. And in this very line, we also discuss the management and prevention strategies. So for this, you can refer to the DNS dated 22nd June 2022. So now let us revise this topic in the textual format also. First, the dominant factors responsible for the flooding in the Himalayan rivers. First, we have discussed the long courses of the rivers and the youth stages of the rivers. This increase the erosive capacity of the northern plain rivers. Second, the weaker nature of the Himalayan rocks also increase the sediment loads which these rivers carry with them. Third, because these rivers are fed by the glaciers and hence glacial melting increase the flood risk. Then we also discuss the geophysical phenomena, for example, the cloudburst as well as the glob phenomena increase the intensity of the rainfalls as well as the discharge of the waters in these rivers. Then we also know that because the northern plain rivers have very huge tributary network and hence ultimately, for example, in the river of Ganga, the water is coming from a large number of tributaries and hence the Ganga in its later stage is accumulating a lot of volume of water which increases the flood levels. Then also we have discussed this monsoonal fact because the northern plains are getting the monsoon from Arabian Sea as well as the Bay of Bengal branch. Then this point is also important. In the lower areas of Bihar as well as West Bengal, there is a meander intersection also. Meander intersection means, for example, the river is going and taking this meandering path. Eventually what will happen, this loop will become more sinus and this will become like this. And then a time might come when the meanders of these rivers and this river might intersect, deviating the flow of water in either direction. And this in turn can make new areas more vulnerable to floods. The last factor we have discussed the high demographic load along the banks of the northern rivers. Similarly, the factors in the peninsular rivers are first because we have hard geological system which does not allow the vertical erosion and hence leads to shallow depth of river courses which cannot store enough water. Next, because of the perpendicular location of the Western Ghats to the Arabian Sea monsoonal branch, there is a very high intense rainfall. Next, the excessive steep slopes of the Western Ghats increase the kinetic energy of the rivers, and as soon as those rivers hit the plain areas, the plain topography, the water spills in the lateral direction. Deforestation, soil erosion, and floodplain encroachment activities further increase the flood proneness of these areas. We have also discussed the particular issue of dam mismanagement. And yes, this factor is also very important because the eastern coasts are very vulnerable to the cyclonic rainfall. And hence, it also happens that at the mouth of these rivers, that is the extreme lower reaches of these rivers, when experience tropical cyclones, again because there is a high intensity of rainfall in this particular area, and that is why the rivers get flooded in this area. So these are all the factors which are dominant in these two regions, and hence will help you to write an answer on this particular theme. So moving with our second topic. This topic has appeared at page number 6 in the article section, and this is the lead article of today's The Hindu Delhi edition. This topic is in relation to the complexities associated with the global geopolitics in various regions. Now, this topic brings us a very important perspective. This topic talks about that despite the fact that Russian Ukraine war is a very significant event as far as the geopolitics is concerned, however, the Western countries, especially the Europe and USA, are excessively focusing towards this particular single event, and they are ignoring the other complex events which are taking place across the world. And that is why this article tries to bring this very perspective and tries to bring out the various issues which are taking place in different regions. From the syllabus perspective, this topic falls under the General Studies Paper 2 section, and that is the International Relations. The micro section says the effects of policies and politics of the developed and the developing countries on Indian interests and Indian diaspora. So, in this very sense, today we will be discussing the various regions and the complex issues which are arising in those regions. The first important region is the Europe. Yes, we agreed that the Russian Ukraine war is also taking place in this particular region, and this has led to various cascading effects. The first and the most important impact of the Russian Ukraine war is that it is setting a wrong precedence. The wrong precedents to have a unilateral attempt to change the international borders. Now, because Russia has done so, it can eventually provoke and build confidence in other countries having similar ambitions in other areas. The second important issue is the rising costs of food, fertilizers, as well as gas. And it has led to serious food crisis in various developing as well as least developing economies, particularly in the region of Africa. It has also led to foreign exchange crisis in various countries as well. So, despite all these significant impacts of the Russian Ukraine war, there are other changes also which are taking place in Europe, and that is particularly in countries like Germany. Now, Germany is having a new leadership, but this new leadership is having a low experience on managing the foreign policies. So that is why it has also created a challenge in Germany's foreign policy. Now, whenever we look Europe, whenever we take Europe into consideration, the three most important countries which have their dominant say in the foreign relations across the world, they are Germany, France, and UK. Now, in Germany, we have discussed the new leadership is lacking the expertise in the foreign policies. Now, come to France. Now, French leadership is facing a severe and staunch opposition from the domestic political parties, which is hindering the independent and efficient role which the French leadership can play. Next comes the NATO, that is the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations. Now, the Russian Ukraine war has proved the NATO to be largely ineffective. It was not able to stop Russia in initial days. Then, in later days, it was not able to repel Russia. And moreover, the routes of sanctions which have been taken place by various countries, these sanctions have not really resulted and impacted Russia to stop its aggression. So that is why the ineffectiveness of NATO in this particular region is also very problematic. And then, despite all these things, the European countries, despite the fact that they are more closer to US, still they are highly dependent on Russia, especially for their energy supplies. And this was one of the biggest reasons that why this particular sanction route could not yield the desired objectives. Now come to the second region, that is the Indo-Pacific complexity. Now here the proximity between China and Russia is increasing, and this has led to complex situations. Because earlier we knew that China is increasing its dominant control, it is trying to unilaterally change the borders, and the South China Sea was one of the most problematic area of this particular region. And China was the sole power in this particular area. Now, this was challenged by countries like Japan, US, Australia, and India, and these four countries formed a body known as Quad. The basic objective of Quad was to ensure peaceful navigation in this area. Similarly, AUKUS was also formed. So, if we closely try to understand the Indo Pacific region, then obviously there are several treaties which are taking place in several countries. And moreover, given the fact that the Indo Pacific region is a storehouse of resources, it has huge economic, social, as well as political significance. This Indo Pacific region is also becoming a hotbed of global geopolitics. Now, come to the South Asian region. Now, in South Asia, also, we are witnessing economic as well as political crisis in Sri Lanka. We also know the Talibanic control in country of Afghanistan, and we are also aware about the fact of rising China in countries like Nepal, Myanmar, Bangladesh, etc. So again, in South Asia and Southeast Asian region also, there is a huge and significant shift which is taking place in terms of economy, polity, as well as security. And because the neighboring countries of India are going through the turmoil, it has a direct impact on the peace and stability of India as well. And then the fourth region which we are going to talk about is the West Asian region. In West Asia also, the Russia and China are increasing their sphere of influence. However, the Iran is being used as fulcrum by Russia and China. Now, this is basically done in order to repel the US led dominance in this area. Further, this area is also affected by Shia Sunni conflicts, and that is why Russia, China, and Iran are leading the one front. And in this particular area, also, there is a reduced friendliness between US as well as Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, US is increasing its friendship with the UAE. Moreover, US is also trying to come up with Quad-like organization in this particular area also, and the important members of that organization would be obviously US, UAE, Israel, and India. Now here again there is a challenge for India. If India joins this partnership, then obviously inherently it will be getting against Russia, China, and Iran. And out of these three countries, Russia is one of the strongest partner of India, as well as India also requires the support of Iran for its long-term strategic benefits. So that is why again the great game in this particular region is also taking the global geopolitics into a new direction. And hence the policymakers should not restrict their understanding of the global geopolitics or the changes or the complexities in it within the narrow dimensions of the Russia-Ukraine war. The policymakers must take into consideration all the factors which are taking place in Europe, Indo Pacific, South and Southeast Asia, as well as West Asia. Because only then India will be in a better position to deal with these changing complexities in the geopolitics and come out with the foreign policy which suits its national interest in the best possible manner. Now, this third topic has appeared at text and the context page. And this topic is in relation to the new and rising industry in India, which is a space industry. The topic reads the private sector boost in India's space industry. Now, as we all know that in some of the developed countries, for example USA, the commercialization and privatization of the space sector is increasing. And this is the very context of this news article too. Even in India, we are trying to increase and tap the potential of the private sector in the space industry. In this very regard, the principal scientific advisor Ajay Kumar Sood stated that the government would soon come up with a new space policy that could initiate the rise of India's own SpaceX-like ventures. Now, this SpaceX ventures, all of you must be knowing, is a very famous company of Elon Musk, which is known for its extra ambitious as well as innovative goals in the domain of space. We would learn that why the private sector should be involved in the space industry, what are its merits, and how can it help India to build its own space industry. The first and the foremost thing which we need to understand is that there is a continuous increase in demand of the services related to the space. Now today is the era of Internet of Things, telecommunications and all those information technology related things which in one way or the other way are dependent on the satellites. Moreover, the space research is also growing, and that is why the private sector investment will provide the additional boost as well as entrepreneurship in the space sector. The second important thing is that it is for the overall growth of the space sector as well as the overall growth of the industries. For example, ISRO's public sector units like Hindustan Aeronautics Limited and several private players, for example L&T, that is Larsen and Toubro, are joining hands in order to make some new technologies in this very sector. So that is why it will establish the inter-industrial linkages among various types of industries, among government as well as private players, and hence it will lead to the overall growth of the space sector. The third important thing is that if we have to compare India's share globally, it is estimated at just $7 billion, which is just 2% of the global space market. So there is a huge gap between this, and hence we need private players to enter this sector and to increase the India share, which can be truly reflected of its potential. Further, as we have already discussed, that international trends and experience, for example Elon Musk's SpaceX, also is signaling the way for developing economies including India to venture into this particular field. Further, because of the innovation and newer entrepreneurship in the space sector, newer technologies can also be built in order to ensure better connectivity and to combat climate related implications, disasters, etc. We all understand that in today's time, even to analyze the atmo-oceanic circulations, for example El Nino, La Nina and all those things, we require a real-time based satellite images, and for that we must have a very efficient space technology. Moreover, talking about India's potential, as we already know that India is a service sector power. The IT services and the telecom services in India is one of the most competent when compared to the other countries. And this thing can be leveraged through the private participation. And to integrate these services with the space-based services, the private participation is very crucial, because even in IT services and telecom sector, the major portion is dominated by the private players. So these are the points which substantiate the need of private sector in space industry of India. However, despite all those merits, there are certain issues and concerns associated with this also. For example, the biggest concern is the data risk. Because the space industry is so sensitive in nature that not just the private but also the data related to the India's defense sector is also governed by various space-based technologies, for example satellite. So it is said that the raw data of the ISRO in the hands of public is very sensitive and there are huge chances of misuse. The second important thing is the regulation, that how to regulate the private sector. Further, in India, the regulatory red tapeism also will hinder the private investment, and that is why the regulatory clearances and unstable political institution can cause unnecessary delays. The third point is relation to the revenue loss, because presently ISRO has a virtual monopoly in the space sector. If the private sector is going to enter in this particular field, then ISRO will lose a fair amount of money it is earning through its space activities. And then with the coming of the private players, the competition rises, and in order to dominate the competition, there are several unprofessional as well as unethical practices in terms of lobbying, corruption, etc. And these activities overall have a detrimental effect on the complete ecosystem. And therefore, in order to deal with such issues and concerns, we need to have certain strategy. So now we will look at what are the recommendations which are given by experts in order to bolster and sustain the private sector in a space industry. The first thing is that the policymakers must demarcate the space from the defense. Now, yes, we understand that this will be a very difficult task, but it is necessary to demarcate the space and defense. Second, in order to increase the innovation, entrepreneurship, and to arrange for the capital, a dedicated fund vehicle for the national prize event can be established just in the form of Google's X Prize. It will attract the young talent and will lead to boosting the entrepreneurship in this particular field. ISRO and its commercial arm, that is Antariksh, must be leveraged to provide the mentorship to the school going as well as college going students. Next, India must come up with its space laws. It must enact the space related legislations to define regulatory, legal, and procedural regimes. The Space Activities Bill, which is pending in the Parliament, must be enacted with necessary reforms. Further, various industrial programs, for example, Make in India program, must be leveraged in order to have indigenous technologies in this particular sector. Further, the think tanks must be established on the lines of European space policy, and industry academia link-ups in space research must be strengthened. So these can be certain way ahead a strategy which can help India to build its own private sector based space industry. Now, from the examinations perspective, we should also be aware that how presently is the private sector involvement regulated in India. The first important body in this regard is the INSPACE, which stands for Indian National Space Promotion and Authorization Center. Now, this word is very important. Now, this body is mandated with the task of promoting, authorizing, and licensing the private players to carry out space activities. It is also an oversight and regulatory body and is responsible for devising various mechanisms to offer the sharing of technology, expertise, and facilities to promote the non-government private entities (NGPEs). So this is the overall body which is there to build and establish the overall ecosystem from regulation to licensing to authorization and to promotion. All the aspects are seen by INSPACE. Now, INSPACE has in itself an important component which is Monitoring and Promotion Directorate. It oversees the non-governmental private entities' activities as per the prescribed regulations and reports back in case any corrective actions are required. Next comes ISRO. ISRO shares its expertise in the matters pertaining to the quality and reliability protocols, documentation, and testing procedure. That means INSPACE is basically to deal with the administrative things, and ISRO is to deal with the technical aspects. Then the third body which was established in 2019 was New Space India Limited, that is NSIL. It is mandated to transfer the matured technologies developed by ISRO to the Indian industries. That means NSIL is tasked with the transfer of technology. That means NSIL is tasked with the transfer of technology. So these are some important dimensions of the overall ecosystem in India. That is the need of the private players in the space industry of India. What are the challenges and issues? What are certain recommendations? And how presently India's private sector is regulated. This topic, backsliding on the climate action, has appeared at page number 7 and is in relation to the Paris climate deal. This article broadly talks about backtracking of the developed countries from the commitments which they had made in the Paris deal and also from the responsibilities which they share morally as well as politically in the sphere of the climate change. In this very regard, in today's session, first we will discuss the important key points of the Paris climate deal, and then we will discuss that how there is a global retreat or the backtrack on the climate action. The commitments which were made by various countries are not being followed in letter and spirit. So let us start our discussion. Now, as we all know that the Paris Climate Deal was an international treaty on climate change. It was adopted at COP21 in Paris and entered into the force on 4th November 2016. The Paris Climate Deal is very well known as it aims to keep the rise of temperature below the 2 degrees Celsius level compared to the global temperatures of the pre-industrial levels. However, more preferable goal of this deal is to restrict the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. In this regard, there are certain key articles in this deal. The first is the article number 2. So keeping the temperature rise below the 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels forms the part of article 2. So you can remember this in the form that the temperature 2 degrees Celsius is part of article 2. Then comes the article 3, that is for mitigation. And as we all know that parties shall communicate their NDCs, that is nationally determined contributions, every 5 years and provide the necessary information for clarity and transparency. Now NDCs were inserted in the Paris deal just to acknowledge the fact that each country is passing through a different socio-economic levels or stages of development, and hence the same commitments cannot be made by every country, and that is why it was left to the countries to come up with their own nationally determined contributions by taking into consideration their own level or stages of development and then designing the policies to achieve all those NDCs. The Article 4 talks about reaching the global peaking of the greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, so that after this phase there is a reduction in the greenhouse gas emission. Now this global peaking word, this word is very important. We will discuss that why is it so important. Article 7 talks about the adaptation measures. It talks about the adaptive capacity, strengthening of the resilience and reducing the vulnerability to climate change as well as related weather extreme events. Article 9 deals with that developed countries shall provide the financial resources to the developing countries. Now this is based on the principle of equity. Now because the developed countries are well versed with technology as well as finances, and hence it is their responsibility to transfer those things to the developing countries so that the global climate action can take place. Article 11 talks about the capacity building under this agreement. And Article 14, again a very important article. This article talks about the global stock take. Now this global stock take will take place in the year 2023 and after that every 5 years. So this global stock take will basically measure the collective progress of all the countries, and hence it will provide the necessary information, the agendas which are to be taken in the next negotiations. So global stock take will be a reference which will be used to further modify or improvise the strategies in order to tackle the climate change. However, in the context of today's article, there are certain concerns and issues. The first and the foremost thing is that the European countries, for example Germany and Netherlands, they are backtracking on their climatic commitments. They are going to restart their coal-based power plants, as well as these countries are also rejecting the European Union's plan to reduce the natural gas consumption by 15%. Second is that the concept of the net zero is being cleverly misinterpreted. Now what do we exactly mean by net zero? Net zero means that whatever emissions of the greenhouse gases are there in this world, all that emission will be stored back into the carbon sinks so that the net emission is zero. It does not talk about reducing the emissions to zero. You can keep on increasing the emissions, but it will not be a problem as far as all that artificial emission is trapped back into the carbon sinks. But now this is being cleverly misinterpreted, because in the Paris deal, the word which is written is the global net zero. That means every country does not have to go for net zero emissions. It is the global net zero. For example, there can be few countries which can keep on emitting the greenhouse gases, and there will be other set of countries which can act as the carbon sinks. So the developed countries are talking about the individual net zero emissions. The reason being the developed countries have the technology to capture that carbon back. But developing countries, because they know that they lack financial and technological resources, and on the other hand, they also have certain developmental needs. They are having one of the highest demographic load. So hence they are talking about the global net zero emissions, not the individualistic net zero emissions. Then the third concern is that earlier the developed countries had pledged to provide $100 billion per year by 2020, but they didn't do that. And after that, we are not having any headway to plan for this, that how to go for this. So there is no headway to the plan of developed countries mobilizing this amount of finance. There is also a lack of genuine transfer of credible technology from the developed to the developing countries. And that is why developing countries are not able to pick up the renewable sources of energy easily. Further, as we all know, that the precedence of the US withdrawal from the Paris deal as well as Kyoto Protocol has affected the credibility of such initiatives. And after the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris deal was signed. But in Kyoto Protocol, there was an important element, that is carbon credits. So the countries like China and India had accumulated a lot of carbon credits, but now after the Paris deal, these countries are struggling for the recognition of their accumulated carbon credits under the Kyoto Protocols. So these are certain concerns which are affecting the credibility of such deals. There are developed economies which are backtracking their commitments. The developing economies have a lot of competing responsibilities, and hence they are not able to restrict their emissions. Despite this fact, we all know that countries like India are coming forward and stretching its responsibilities and are taking huge steps in order to combat this climate change. So now is the time for the reference article. This topic has appeared at page number 10 and is in relation to the Collegium system. Recently, Supreme Court has recommended 35 names of judges in 6 high courts as part of their Collegium power. So in this regard, you should be aware about what exactly is Collegium system, what are its constitutional backgrounds, or what are the various Supreme Court judgments associated with this. So this topic was already covered in the DNS dated 6th May 2022. So you people are requested to go back to the DNS dated 6th May 2022 in order to understand all the dimensions associated with the appointment of the Supreme Court and High Court judges in our country. So now is the time for the question of the day. The question from yesterday's DNS is in front of you. The question was in relation to the snow leopard. There were 2 statements given. It is classified as endangered species under IUCN based classification, and second statement was it is found only in the Arctic and Antarctic regions. Now you have to find the correct statements, and both these statements are incorrect because it is vulnerable under IUCN based classification and it is also found in the Himalayas. So that is why option D, that is neither 1 nor 2, is the correct answer. The question from today's DNS is in relation to the global stocktake. Which of the following articles deal with the global stocktake under the Paris Climate Deal? Option A, Article 4, B, Article 11, C, Article 14, or D, Article 13. So that's all for today. All the very best and study hard.